This is Break It Down to the T, where we don't just review films, we diagnose them. Every character you've ever watched on screen, they have a condition, and we're here to name it, unpack it, and show you exactly how it plays out in the story. Think of us as the shrinks Hollywood never hired. Welcome to the couch. Today's patient is a movie with a 100% critic score. Teenage sex and death at Camp Miasma. What happens when these two women actually meet is where it gets interesting for us, because this isn't a mentorship story. This isn't even really a horror movie plot in the traditional sense. What we're watching is one woman's fixation curdle into something obsessive, something that blurs the line between admiration and consumption. And the actress on the other end isn't just some passive object either. She's got her own reasons for staying hidden all these years, her own psychology built entirely around survival and performance and never letting anyone see what's actually underneath. You've got a young director, queer, hungry, basically desperate to prove herself, who gets handed the reins to resurrect a dead slasher franchise. And the way she chooses to do that isn't through a good script or a smart marketing plan. It's by tracking down the original final girl, the actress who played the survivor decades ago and then just vanished, went reclusive, disappeared from the industry entirely. So we've got obsession on one side. We've got a woman who spent her whole adult life performing a version of herself that isn't real on the other. And the two of them together spiral into something the film itself calls psychosexual mania, which, honestly, doing our job for us a little bit there. But we're gonna take that and get specific. Real diagnoses, real case studies, not just vibes. Give me a sec and I'll start blocking out which condition goes where. Let's actually walk through this thing, because the plot is doing more heavy lifting than the marketing wants you to notice. So Kris, that's our director, played by Hannah Einbinder, and she's introduced to us as this scrappy, enthusiastic, kind of desperate to prove herself filmmaker, who gets handed a franchise nobody actually wanted her to have. Camp Miasma has been dead for years at this point. Slapdash sequels, waning fandom, the whole thing limping along on nostalgia fumes. And instead of doing what any sane studio executive would tell her to do, which is just cast some hot 22-year-olds and call it a day, Kris decides the only way to resurrect this franchise is to go find the original final girl. And here's where it gets weird already, because the final girl trope, if you know your horror history, is supposed to be about survival, about the one woman who makes it out, who beats the monster. But what happens to her after the credits roll? Nobody ever asks that question, and that's exactly the hole this movie climbs into. Billy Preston, played by Gillian and Anderson, is that final girl. Decades removed from the original film, completely reclusive, shrouded in mystery, according to basically every synopsis you'll read. And that's not marketing fluff. That's the entire engine of the story. Because when Kris tracks her down, she's not meeting a washed-up actress looking for a comeback. She's meeting someone who built an entire adult life around disappearing. So you've already got two women walking into this thing with completely incompatible psychologies. One who wants to be seen so badly, she's willing to dig up a ghost to do it. And one who spent 30 years making sure nobody could find her. That tension alone, before anything even happens between them, is the whole movie in miniature. Now, here's your first real hook. What happens when obsession meets someone who spent her whole life avoiding exactly that kind of attention? Because Kris doesn't just want Billy for the role. She wants Billy. Her attention, her mythology, her past. And that wanting starts as professional interest, and it does not stay there for long. The two of them start working together, and the script doesn't ease you into what happens next. It calls it directly, a descent into psychosexual mania. And honestly, that's the movie handing us the diagnosis on a platter, except a platter's too clean a metaphor for what's actually happening on screen. This isn't tidy. This is desire and fear and delirium all tangled up together. And the horror elements, the little death, the spear-wielding figure haunting the edges of this whole thing, start to feel less like an external monster and more like a physical manifestation of whatever's building between these two women. And that's hook number 2 right there. The monster in this movie might not be a monster at all. It might just be what obsession looks like once it stops being containable. What's fascinating from a clinical lens, and we'll get way deeper into this in a minute, is that neither woman is the clean victim here. Kris isn't some innocent fan who got in over her head. Her fixation has edges to it that look a lot like something you'd actually find in a diagnostic manual, not just movie shorthand for a clush. And Billy isn't just a reluctant recluse either. Her decision to vanish wasn't passive. It was constructed, maintained, defended. That takes a specific kind of psychological architecture to sustain for decades. So here's your third hook, and honestly, it might be the sharpest one. What if survival itself, the thing horror movies always frame as the happy ending, is actually its own kind of trauma response that just never got treated? Billy Preston survived Camp Miasma, and then she spent the rest of her life still running from it. Just quieter, less bloody. Same instinct, though. By the time these two women are fully entangled, the line between director and muse, between admiration and possession, between making a movie and making a person disappear into your own narrative, that line is basically gone. And the film wants you sitting in that discomfort. It's not interested in giving you a clean hero or a clean monster. It wants you asking who's actually doing harm to who here. And that, right there, is why this is such a good patient for us. Because on the surface, this is a slasher comedy. It's got that title, it's got the tone, critics are calling it funny and sexy and strange all at once. But underneath all of that is a genuinely disturbing character study about two women whose psychological damage fits together like a lock and key. One person's need to be consumed, another person's need to consume. And a franchise built on death acting as the perfect backdrop for both of them to finally act it out. So that's our story. Now, let's get into the couch work. Two women, two very different conditions, and one obsession that's going to tie them together whether they like it or not. Let's talk about who's actually in this thing, because the casting here is doing something smart, and I don't think it's an accident. Start with Hannah Einbinder playing Kris, and if you know her at all, it's probably from Hacks, where she plays Ava, this fast-talking, anxious, ambitious young comedy writer stuck orbiting a legend who both terrifies and fascinates her. And that's your first hook right there, because that dynamic, young, ambitious woman fixated on an older woman who holds all the mythology and all the power, that's basically the exact shape of this new role too. Einbinder isn't stretching into unfamiliar territory here. She's taking a dynamic she's already proven she can play with precision and turning the dial way past comedy into something much darker and much hungrier. Which honestly makes me trust the casting more, not less. She already knows how to play obsession disguised as ambition. Then you've got Gillian Anderson as Billy Preston. And look, if there's one actress on the planet who's built a career on playing women who are composed on the surface and completely unknowable underneath, it's her. The X-Files, Scully. Decades of playing someone who investigates the unexplainable while keeping her own interior life locked down tight. And here, she's basically playing the flip side of that. A woman who isn't investigating a mystery, she is the mystery. She spent 30 years constructing a persona specifically so nobody could get past it. That's hook number 2. Casting Anderson here isn't just prestige, it's thematically loaded. She spent her whole career embodying restraint, and now she's playing what restraint costs a person after decades of practicing it. And this is where I want you to notice something, because it's actually really clever. The director behind this whole thing is Jane Schoenbrun, who made I Saw the TV Glow, a movie that's basically obsessed with identity dissolving, with characters who aren't sure if the person they're performing is more real than the person underneath. Schoenbrun keeps returning to this idea across their work, and casting these two actresses, one known for playing barely contained anxiety, and one known for playing barely penetrable composure, that's not random. That's a director who understands exactly what tension they're building before a single line of dialogue gets written. Now, the supporting cast is where it gets even more interesting for us, because a lot of these names carry their own baggage that colors how we read the psychology on screen. Jasmine Savoy Brown, who you'll know from Yellow Jackets, a show that is literally about trauma warping an entire group of women over decades. Casting her here isn't incidental. She brings an audience association with sustained psychological damage before she even says a word. That's a hook worth sitting with. The casting itself is preloading trauma into the frame. Eva Victor is in this too, fresh off Sorry Baby, which is this incredibly quiet, incredibly devastating movie about processing an assault years after the fact, and never quite being able to name it directly. And that thematic through line, delayed processing, avoidance, the gap between what happened and what someone's able to say out loud about it, that's going to be relevant to basically everything we talk about with Billy's character later. Zach Cherry shows up too, and if you watched Severance, you know he's got this specific talent for playing men who are compliant on the surface, while something's clearly eating at them underneath, which again feels less like coincidence and more like a director stacking the deck with actors who already know how to hold two truths at once on their face. Jack Haven, who worked with Schoenbrun before on I Saw the TV Glow, brings a continuity to this, an actor the director already trusts to sit inside disorientation and identity confusion without flinching. And then you've got Patrick Fischler and Dylan Baker rounding things out, Both of them guys who've spent careers playing the uncomfortable, slightly off, something's not right here character actor roles, which tells you the tone this movie is going for, even in its smaller parts. So here's the thing I want you to walk away with, before we get into the actual diagnoses. This cast wasn't assembled just because these are good actors, though obviously they are. It was assembled because almost every single one of them has spent their careers specializing in some version of the exact psychological terrain this movie wants to explore. Repression, delayed trauma, fractured identity, obsession masquerading as care. You put all of that history in one cast list, and then you point two of the most controlled actresses working today at each other and tell them to unravel. That's not an accident. That's a director who did their homework on exactly who could carry this. Alright, actors are locked in, you know who's playing who and why it matters. Alright, time to get these two women on the couch, because we've been circling long enough. Let's start with Kris, because her condition is actually the easier one to spot on the surface, and then it gets more complicated the deeper you go. What Kris has isn't just professional enthusiasm tipping into obsession. What she's showing is something closer to erotomanic and parasocial fixation, the kind of psychological pattern where someone builds an entire emotional reality around a person they've mythologized from a distance. And then once they finally get access to that person, the fixation doesn't calm down, it accelerates. That's actually a documented pattern in clinical literature around parasocial attachment. The idea that distance doesn't cool obsession. Proximity does the opposite. It feeds it, because now the fantasy has real texture to attach itself to. And you can trace this directly in how the film sets her up. Kris isn't hired to make a good movie, she's hired to resurrect a franchise, and instead of doing the job in any conventional sense, she makes the entire project about accessing Billy specifically. That's your first real clinical flag, when the stated goal quietly gets replaced by a fixation on one person, and the person doing it doesn't even seem to notice the substitution happening. This is actually really similar to something researchers have documented in celebrity worship syndrome studies, where fans don't just admire a public figure, they start organizing real-world decisions, jobs, relationships, entire life choices around getting closer to that figure. Kris resurrecting a dead franchise just to get in a room with her final girl is basically a big-budget version of that same wiring. Now, Billy is the more interesting patient, honestly, because her condition isn't obsession, it's the opposite. It's decades of avoidant, defensive withdrawal that's calcified into a full identity. And this is where I want to be specific, instead of just throwing around the word reclusive like every article about this movie does. What Billy is exhibiting looks a lot like complex post-traumatic stress, with a heavy dissociative component, specifically the kind that develops after a single, extreme, life-threatening event, rather than repeated childhood trauma. That distinction actually matters clinically. Survivors of a single acute trauma, especially something violent and public, like surviving a massacre that then gets turned into entertainment for decades, often show a different symptom profile than people with developmental trauma. They don't necessarily struggle with trust in the diffuse way developmental trauma survivors do. Instead, they organize their entire life around avoidance of anything that could reopen the original wound. And that's exactly what 30 years of reclusiveness is. It's not shyness. It's not an aging actress protecting her privacy, the way tabloids like to frame these things. It's a woman who survived something so violent, it got franchised, and who has spent every year since constructing distance between herself and any reminder of it. The horror genre has actually made a small cottage industry out of ignoring this reality. It loves the final girl trope, but it almost never asks what happens to her nervous system afterward. And this movie is basically the first one I've seen that takes that question seriously instead of treating survival as an ending point. So now, put these two women in a room together, and you can already predict what's going to happen psychologically before the plot even does it for you. Kris's fixation needs an object, and Billy's avoidance has spent 30 years being airtight, untested by anyone with this specific kind of persistence. What happens when an erotomanic fixation meets someone whose defenses were built specifically to survive intense pursuit? You get exactly what the film calls psychosexual mania, except now we can actually name the mechanism underneath that phrase. It's not random chaos. It's Kris's fixation finally finding a crack in 30 years of avoidance, and Billy's trauma responses getting triggered by the exact kind of intense, consuming attention she spent her whole adult life avoiding. There's actually a real-world parallel here that's worth sitting with for a second, and it's not a horror movie case study. It's something you see in actual clinical reports around trauma survivors who become public figures. Survivors of mass violence who end up in the media spotlight often describe a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the original trauma and everything to do with being perpetually reapproached by people who want access to their story. Every new person who shows up wanting to understand what happened to them functions like a small reactivation of the original event. Billy isn't just avoiding cameras or interviews, she's avoiding the specific experience of being seen as a symbol instead of a person, which is precisely what Kris is doing to her the second they meet, mythologizing her instead of actually seeing her. And that's the trap this movie sets for both of them. Kris genuinely believes she's honoring Billy by wanting her this badly, and Billy's entire psychological architecture is built to read that exact kind of wanting as a threat. Two conditions that look completely different on paper, obsessive fixation on one side, dissociative avoidance on the other, and yet they're basically mirror images of the same root problem. Neither woman has ever learned how to want something or be wanted without it turning into consumption. Next, we get into how this actually plays out scene by scene, and where the horror imagery itself starts functioning as a symptom instead of just a backdrop. The clearest example is the Little Death, the spear-wielding figure that haunts the edges of this whole story. And I want you to notice something about how that figure gets used, because it's not deployed like a traditional slasher villain who's hunting people down for body count. It shows up specifically in moments where Kris and Billy's dynamic tips further into obsession, which tells you the film is using it less like an external threat and more like a hallucinated symptom, almost the same way trauma flashbacks get visualized in other movies, except here it's wearing full horror movie iconography instead of quick, disorienting cuts. That's actually a smart choice narratively, because dissociative trauma responses often do feel exactly like that to the person experiencing them, less like a memory and more like something physically present in the room again. And this lines up with something real that shows up in trauma research around reactivation, the idea that survivors of violent events don't just remember the trauma, they can experience genuine perceptual intrusions, moments where the nervous system responds as if the original threat is happening again in real time. Combat veterans report this. Survivors of violent assault report this. The brain doesn't file trauma away as a clean memory. It files it as a live threat that can get re-triggered by anything that resembles the original context closely enough. So every time Billy is pushed further into intimacy with Kris and the Little Death shows up again, the movie isn't cheating with random horror beats to keep the audience awake. It's visualizing exactly what a dissociative flashback function looks like from the inside.